this is my share where I've got your thumbnail picture. So this is Mao Mei, the Assistant Director of CalADAR, and she is going to share some slides and talk about this program CalADAR. So now I'm going to stop my sharing, and hopefully Mao Mei can share her screen.
Sure. Great. All right. Ryan, are you able to see it?
Yes, it looks good to me.
All right, great. So I'll put it into presentation view. All right, well, welcome. Thank you very much for having me, Professor Edwards, and all the graduate student instructors and all your undergrads. It's amazing that you have like almost 50 people at the start of class. I mean, it's a large class, I suppose, but it's amazing that you all have shown such resilience over these, it's hard to believe that it was just a month ago when we started this online, adventure that we are on. So please recognize for us all, how far we've come and how we've been able to pivot. I think it's really important to keep recognizing that. All right, well, so I am, as Professor Edwards said, Mao Mei Liu, and I'm a research faculty in the Department of Demography. And I also work for the CalADAR program. It's a federally funded program to advance diversity in aging research. And at UC Berkeley, we do that by equipping underrepresented undergraduate students in order to do quantitative social science research, specifically demography of aging. So this is something that if you're taking Demography Econ 175, you're definitely in, some of your interests definitely overlap with our program's interests. So what is demography of aging? So this is researchers use data to examine aging processes and life course dynamics. We take kind of a broader look. So like aging very strictly would be older folks, 65 and above, 55 and above, depending on how you define it. But we take a broader look and try to, be open to understanding, examining how early life conditions or events affect later life outcomes. So, and we want to take a population perspective, a demographic perspective, and there's often a focus on health, inequality, migration, and more families, things that you have talked about in this specific class as well, which is why I'm here. I don't visit every class. I don't visit every econ class. I don't visit every demography class. And so I'm just glad to be here with you today. All right, so who's eligible? This is a targeted program because we are trying to, remedy some of the major issues in academia, put our little grain of salt into it. And so what we're really interested in kind of is widening what people call the pipeline of students who are interested in going to graduate school and then becoming PhD researchers inside, outside academia, making public policy. It's really important for both the research, public policy worlds to have all of society represented. If not, people just, carry their own biases, their own experiences. It's really hard for people to be as imaginative as we need to be when we're, dealing with the world. And that's evident now as well in these current times. So a student should have a plan or interest in grad school related to quantitative social sciences, econ, public policy, public health, soc are all things that we definitely support. You should have at least 2 semesters left in Berkeley. So earliest graduation would be May 2021. Be doing very well academically overall and also in the prereqs. You must fit at least one underrepresented category. So you should identify as an underrepresented minority historically or individual with disabilities. What does CalADAR require? It's an academic program. This is trying to get you ready in a spot where you could apply to grad school right as you're even an undergraduate at Berkeley or a year or 2 out. So we want you to actually successfully complete demography courses. These include sex, death, and data, which is cross-listed in Soc and demography, taught by Jennifer Johnson-Hanks in the fall. A course about migration and how to write a quantitative research paper. So starting with identifying a research question to analyzing data. So we're using current American Community Survey, General Social Survey, as well as the Mexican Migration Project. And people are using whatever tools that they know coming in, but we've done a little bit of training in R in the course. But you could use Stata. Some people are using Excel or the online analysis if they haven't had as much experience. And that is be offered in the spring. In the fall, we also run a workshop that's applying to graduate school and professionalization. And so all these courses are actually available to you, whether or not you are accepted or eligible to apply to CalADAR. So if you're interested in, kind of pursuing the CalADAR experience, but don't get in, or aren't eligible, or for whatever reason, consider taking these courses. They're part of, I think, what could get you ready to become a researcher. As well, if you take some of these courses and you have 175, you could actually be very close to completing a demography minor. So keep that in mind as well. Plus, students also do coursework in a substantive area of interest. So this usually is different for each scholar, right? So each person has their interest that they want to develop, the professors that they are working with. Often our scholars want to develop interests in family, education, health, kind of inequalities, social stratification on a kind of a broader scale. We require a quantitative methods course, which I think if you're an econ major, you're going to fulfill this because it's one of the requirements of the course, an upper div methods course where you're going to learn more about R or Stata, get some programming experience, get some practical quasi-research experience, and then there's participation in CalADAR activities. The benefits of joining CalADAR are there's financial support for up to 2 semesters. We are currently applying for renewal funding for our next 5 years, and so the paid summer internship is pending funding, and then if we get that renewal, all people who are now admitted now would be supported up to 3 semesters financially. And we support students far after they graduate, because usually people want to work a while before they actually apply to graduate school. And it takes a while to get your undergraduate research submitted to international conferences or submitted for research journals. There's mentored research with faculty and graduate students. So we find that really an apprenticeship kind of model, like a URAP or a URAP-like model, where students are really working alongside faculty and graduate students to support the research of these faculty and graduate students, to be a real way that that's how we've all learned how to do research. Few of us learn on our own. It's always really good to, we don't need to reinvent the wheel before we do independent research. It's really good to do a lot of mentored research, or even alongside. One-on-one mentoring with CalADAR faculty, which includes myself and the executive director of the Berkeley Population Center, Leora Lawton. Scholars seem to really, really appreciate the community of peers we have. So we have like a monthly family dinner that sometimes involves, like walking meditation and or having a clinical psychologist come talk about imposter syndrome and well-being in the time of COVID-19, or cozy dinners with our grad school mentors, or just hanging out, just having food together. Usually we're able to have food together in the same room. Now we're doing it virtually. And then there's just a whole bunch of other benefits. GRE prep, career training. We all get to travel together to an international conference, which was supposed to be in DC this month and will be in St. Louis next year. So if you're interested, what can you do? Check out our website. There's slightly more information there. It's a work in progress. So, your feedback on that is welcome, but we know there's plenty of work to do. Please fill out an interest form. There's a Google form here, and I can copy and paste this and put this into the class chat. I think as a host, I'll be able to do that before I sign off. And then just keep in mind for the fall 2020 cohort, which if we don't get our renewal funding, which may be our last, but we fully expect to, we fully hope to get the renewal. And if we don't get it through this time, we'll submit it again. Please submit your application by May 1st. All right. So, and just, in the interest form, there's questions there. So you should feel free to send me questions that way. Thank you, Professor Ryan.
Thank you so much, Maume. Are there any questions? Would anybody like to raise a hand or type in the chat? Okay, well, thank you so very much. And Professor Liu will be available offline to answer questions, and you can also ask them of me and I can pass them along, the way you'd like to go.
What did I call the 126? I didn't call it sex, death, and data?
No, you did. You did. And I didn't know the number, actually.
Oh, yeah, it's 126. I know. They changed the name of the course, and then it's just become much more popular. I mean, Jenna's doing amazing as well.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, with a title like that, you can't go wrong.
Yeah.
It's classic. It's
pretty cool. People like it. If you like this course, I think you'll like the other one. Yeah.
Good. Yeah.
Right,
the other things to note. Yeah. Thanks so very much. I'll see you later.
Bye-bye. Have a good one.
Okay. Thanks. Okay. So let me share my screen. Is that visible to everybody now? We're back on my screen. Hopefully we're okay. Actually, just before I go off that page, the fun thing there is Maume's fantastic. She's the assistant director. Leora Lawton is the director of the program. And I've had the pleasure of working with Maume, with both of them, but with Maume on an immigration topic. So today we're talking about some of the economics of immigration. She and I was having some flashbacks because she and I were presenting via video conference our work that was commissioned by one of the DC think tanks to look at the effect of immigration on employment, I think is what ultimately it was. There's been great interest in these topics. And so if these things interest you, aging research can, broadly speaking, also mean aging immigrants. So there's a lot of good crossover and pollination there. The biggest challenge, if you're concerned about this, it's a real one, your eligibility for CalADAR. So it's aimed toward underrepresented groups, and so you may not qualify. And that's unfortunate. It shouldn't deter you from reaching out and working in this sandbox, because I think it's a fantastic one. Okay, so moving ahead, let's just quickly look at the calendar. I don't have anything new to say here, other than we are even more rapidly approaching the end of everything. So here we are on Thursday. It's actually my mother's birthday today. She turned 77 on the 9th of April. Got a nice little video sent up for her. So we're sending sending love to her. We're talking about the economics of immigration here today. We've got these National Academies reports, which I'll talk about in a bit. And Tuesday may be more on the economic impacts of immigration. I'll need to kind of reset some of the topics here. So if you're unable to do these readings, I think the highlights chapter, I hope, is somewhat brief here. This can get pretty down into the weeds, I think, especially this chapter 7. I think for a lot of this stuff, it's okay not to read in advance. What's good to read in advance are things like the reading for today, the chapters 4 and 5, which are set out in a surprisingly nicely pedagogical setup, really. I think in a sense, because at the time, the National Academies and the panel was trying to educate the public in a way that you and I are engaging in today, to try to think about these things with some rigor and also with some science, rather than with a lot of polemic, as sometimes it becomes. What we do on the 23rd is a little bit still up in the air. It might be a COVID-19 talk, maybe, or it might be more immigration. We'll see. We might also talk about mortality, which of course is part of the story with COVID-19. But another, I would say, bunch of big parts of the story of mortality that are useful to talk about, that I think maybe should spend some time, is what's been happening with the opioid epidemic recently, which prior to COVID-19 was kind of the big story with mortality. So I think we'll have a lot of things to choose from, and I'll let you know what we're doing as we go. Okay. Oh, there's a good question in the chat. Are the 2 lecture slide versions the same? They have different names, but the same number of slides. They are the same. If your download connection and your computer can handle it, or depending on what you're doing, if you're on a phone or a tablet, you might choose the one that the title of it is something like compressed, I think. So that's the one I have on my phone here. And the reason is it's a smaller file size. So there are a bunch of images in the slides today, and I wanted to make it easy on everybody. So happy birthday, Mrs. Mom, Professor Edwards. Technically, it's my mother's birthday. Thanks. That was fun for the chat. Okay, moving ahead. Before we dive into the course material, I wanted to make a pitch for Census 2020, which we've talked about before, and may have slipped under your radar. And the punchline at the bottom of the slide is, if this is too hard, don't sweat it. But if you can and are, have not replied to the census, this is the world in which we live in. The census wants you to fill out the form. This is the second bullet about your whereabouts on April 1st, if COVID had not moved you, if it did. So some of you are still in the same place that you have been, but I know some of you, and again, there's a student who joined my office hours all the way from China, and I couldn't tell whether she's still in quarantine. I think maybe she had left and it was in a 14-day quarantine in a hospital and all that. So many of you have moved. The objective here is to try to get a measure of population so that government budget expenditures are apportioned in the best way possible to reflect the disposition of the population. So what census wants you to do is tell census where you would have been on April 1st if COVID hadn't hit. So that may be a bit confusing. It may also be hard if you fit the third bullet point here, or I'm sorry, rather the fourth. If you were in dorms in the third bullet point, you're probably in good shape because UC Berkeley would have counted you in what are called the group quarters measure. And so group quarters include dorms. Of course, you know, dorms are not that plentiful here at UC Berkeley, so it may be a very small share of you out there who are in dorms, especially since this is an upper division course. But I'm guessing the international students may have been in dorms, and I think would be counted because it's people who are resident. And even if you're an international student, you're not a citizen, you're counted as being a resident here, for example. The tricky part would be is if you were in an apartment in Berkeley, but if you left town to say go back home in a different state or in another part of California, if you can, try to respond. Each housing unit should have received a mailing which gives you a code. So if somebody got that mailing, they could enumerate you. If they're a roommate of yours, or maybe even the landlord, I suppose, could do it, but probably not, knowing most landlords. Also, if all of the roommates, if all of you left town, then you probably could go online and do it at My Census 2020. I got that right, or it could be My 2020 Census or something. So you could do it online without a code. You can also have a roommate do it for you. And so let me pause there and ask, oh good, yeah, thanks to Dan in the chat there for filling it out online with that link, so my2020census.gov. And if you navigate there, it should step you through it. There was a part where I got confused because it asks you, well, where were you on April 1st, 2020? And you have to answer it in a way, I think, you know, that's figurative if you're not actually in the place you would have been. Are there questions? Busy year. Coronavirus, census 2020. I was telling my 3.5-year-old daughter that she'll be 13 and a half when the next census rolls around, and she'll almost be in high school. All these changing seasons and everything. Okay. This was a fun graph that Berkeley side put out, a fun chart of the undercounts in the 2010 census. What was striking to me was why there's a color out here in what is actually the Albany bulb out here at the left. This is the Berkeley Marina. I'm not sure anybody actually lives there. There might be some, and the Albany bulb is a weird one to color, and so they may have just gotten an error there. But of course, the eye is drawn to this big swath down here, which is west side and south side. So traditionally, there have been difficulties counting people because of, you know, they're students and they move around a lot. So if you can reach out to census, they have said they'd rather have duplicate measures because you do it through an address and your name and your birth date and things like that. So if you duplicate it because you and a roommate are both doing it and you both measure yourself or something, that they don't care about that. There are ways of removing the duplicate measure. They're most concerned with trying to actually get everybody measured in the right place, which matters a lot for California versus a different, you know, place where people might be, for example. Okay. Questions about the census? Sorry, before I go on. It's fun to distract oneself, I think, with challenges that seem rather mundane, really, at the end of it all, compared to what we're doing and dealing with on a daily basis these days, just getting yourself measured. If you have to, how many people have taken the census? Anybody want to raise their hand if you've filled out a census form or been enumerated? Several of you have. 5, 10 maybe, yeah. Did you enter something for your national origin or not? That was the big question. If you filled it out online, you had to enter some text string for your national origin after you enter your racial identity. So that was an interesting one for me. I raised a fun conversation with my parents, including my mother, again, whose birthday it is today, all about her genealogy, which she's interested in tracing, and that's her family history. And so she actually came out with this surprisingly detailed thing. Of course, it was all in factors of 2, because that's how we measure these things, because of the biological contributions of different people from different places. So that was that was fun. And this is the first time I think that the census has actually forced people to do this. And again, you could have, if you want to, in your census form, you can just leave it blank with a space bar or like a letter or a number or something like that if you feel like it. But the intent is to try to, I think, better measure, for example, people who would describe themselves as white or Caucasian, but they might trace their national origin to a place like Iran or Azerbaijan or Armenia, which are not sort of traditional places of origin for the white population as we usually conceptualize it, but you know, can be, of course. So that, I think, was the motivation there. It's a fun little thing, again, to keep your mind off of all the crazy stuff going on, if it's helpful. All right, so let's talk about immigration. So immigration is the second to last big topic. We're going to talk about mortality also. And there's just a lot of fascinating things. So I thought I'd spend several slides here talking about what the big pictures are. And we're going to cover and descend into many of these to some extent, and certainly focusing more on the economic stuff. There's a lot of things, of course, about immigration that falls more usually into sociological research and other pockets in which demography sits or straddles. And we'll cover some of that. A lot of the graphs and the slides actually are from what is colloquially called the sociology report of the National Academies, which was chaired by the great Mary Waters of Harvard, who's a fantastic sociologist. So there's a lot there as well, but I don't personally know a ton about the details and the granular stuff of a lot of the sociology. So we may get into it, but I think we're going to focus on the econ mostly. So what does immigration do to wages? That's one of the biggest macro questions here. The secondary things, of course, are, in addition to wages, which is the price of one of the big factor inputs, the other one might be the returns to capital. You could also think about the returns to land, another factor input that's a complement to labor. What happens to overall output? What does immigration do to unemployment? And these things, I think, are quite front of mind because of what happened almost 4 years ago, obviously, with the incoming Trump administration and what became front and center. But they're probably perennially interesting, and we'll get to some of that in a few slides about the sort of culture of it all, or the zeitgeist of immigration, which, you know, it's been a pretty big deal. Are effects different on the short run versus the long run? What does immigration do to scientific discovery, innovation, and technological progress? And there, it's important that we keep in mind that there's this avenue, that in addition to physical factors of production, it's also the non-physical ones that might well be very important. And I think we're at the cusp of understanding some of that. And I hope we can cover more of it. It's not kind of in the core of the 175 materials, but it's important. Through all of this, we should keep in mind that the answer to these questions, what are the effects of, might be zero for all of these things. It could be zero, it could be positive, or it could be negative. And I tried to phrase all these things with that in mind, that there could be a positive impact on any variable or a negative one, or zero. Could be any of those things. And of course, it might vary depending on what you're talking about, whether it's immigrants who are refugees or immigrants who are economic immigrants who arrive not because of persecution, but because they want to make money and to work in the economy. What are sectoral impacts, meaning which industries employ immigrant labor and what kind? Is it high skill or low skill? And more on that in a moment. And of course, one of the big things here is which sectors employ authorized versus unauthorized labor. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. Social impacts. Do immigrants assimilate? Do they adopt local traditions and cultures? And here, the funny thing to point out, especially when one talks about health and healthy behaviors, some local traditions and cultures are probably bad in that sense of being unhealthy rather than being healthy. So not all local traditions and cultures are positive things, but we often speak as though they ought to be somehow, that all immigrants, everybody in the United States ought to adopt these local traditions and cultures that we have. And of course, the other thing that's a bit unspoken here is is where, where do these local traditions and cultures come from? Well, few of them, of course, are really indigenous, namely associated with Native Americans who themselves can trace their genetic ancestry to immigrants across the Bering Strait from Asia. But I think a reasonable thing is to say, well, immigrants in the United States historically have included all white Europeans and everybody else after them who've arrived. Where do these traditions and cultures come from? From everywhere, obviously. It's a big melting pot. But what we mean are the traditions and cultures prevailing today, because we think that those are important, and what happens to them, what changes may come are also important. Does immigration strengthen or weaken social, legal, and political institutions? And so this is a big one when one thinks about why some countries are rich and some countries are poor. One of the big reasons is the strength of the legal and political institutions. Namely, we have a government that has functioned continuously since 1788, I want to say, even during times of great upheaval and times of great political turmoil, even during times of shelter in place and pandemics. Other countries are not nearly so lucky. And one of the big questions I think that will emerge is what will happen to governments around the world because of the pandemic? Which will survive and which will not. We have one that appears to be able to evolve and adapt, and that probably is a big reason why the United States is as rich as it is, and why we are as well off as we are, and why immigrants are drawn to coming to the United States. A big one here too, of course, is do immigrants commit crime? How much? And compared to what? Compared to natives, for example, is a reasonable thing. And well, maybe we all know this already, but you know, this becomes a very quickly sort of political or ideological thing. And one can look at it in a very different way. Well, let's look at crime statistics and see who is committing crimes. And the answer may surprise you there, that immigrants on average commit fewer crimes than natives do. Fiscal or budgetary impacts. And so this might be the thing that throws you for the biggest loop. It's a question about what the net taxes or net government benefits received might look like for an immigrant versus somebody else. Here too, it's a relative thing. Different individuals who are natives have different net fiscal impacts over their life cycles. When we're born, we all sit around for a while and then we go to school, which is publicly funded for most of us. Not preschool, generally speaking, but kindergarten, of course, in the United States is a very big public outlay, and we're absorbing those benefits for a long time until we graduate and go to UC Berkeley, and then we start absorbing more benefits because it turns out UC Berkeley, even though it's expensive, is also subsidized by taxpayers in the state of California. And then finally, at, I don't know, age 25 or something like that, we'll have a graph that we can look at. You maybe start breaking even and start paying for your way a bit more than you were. And this is true about everybody. So one issue here, of course, is that immigrants are not the same in terms of an age structure compared to natives. They typically are younger with more younger children because they are younger working age. And so you might very well expect immigrants in a snapshot to be paying less in taxes than they're absorbing in benefits, at least in the household sense, because they have lots of little kids. So that's one perspective here, and we'll delve into that next week. Does the level of government matter is a little bit stickier here too. And it's very specific to a study of the United States versus other governments, where the state versus federal and local distinction is going to be different. Here in the United States, schools are funded by states and localities, and things like Social Security, pensions, and the federal income tax, those are all at the federal level. They have very different age impacts or age structures, if you like, and so therefore the fiscal impacts of immigrants are very different at the state and local and federal levels. And finally, what about unauthorized immigrants? What does it mean to be unauthorized or undocumented? So in our heads, we probably have this rather ugly caricature of somebody hopping the fence down in Arizona or Southern California. And the fact is that unauthorized immigrants can look like that, and they can also look very different than that. Famously, there was a study that implied that the current First Lady of the United States was probably an unauthorized immigrant during an earlier stage of her life when she was modeling but didn't actually have the work visa to do it. Many different people can be unauthorized. And it's different, you know, from being illegal. And we're going to avoid using that word because it can often sort of turn into a pejorative and be used in a pejorative sense. And also the legal status is often rather murky. You might be in violation of a visa, but it's not obvious what exactly that means legally at the state level, for example. You can be, of course, be deported because of the legal setup and the way that ICE operates and all that. So we're going to avoid that, calling folks illegal or not, because the other perspective is that people cannot be illegal, which I think is a pretty healthy one to take. You could be unauthorized, you could be undocumented without papers, and that subjects people, of course, to the risk of deportation. How does that affect investments and economic activity? How does it affect those sorts of things differently depending on your age and your status when you had authorized or unauthorized status? And the big issue, of course, these days is what will happen to what are usually called dreamers, the individuals who are brought as children, who are unauthorized immigrants, but were not aware that they were unauthorized, and probably not until they grew up and discovered the unfortunate truth that for people like them, a path to authorized status is still at best murky. Okay, so before I move on, let me pause and ask if there are any questions about any of these terms or the definitions. Next, we're going to talk about some contemporary takes. Any questions? So I can see already we're not going to get through all the slides today, and that's just fine. I thought it was great that Mao Mei could come and talk to you about CalIDAR and give you a sense too about the breadth of diverse backgrounds in the field and what demography is trying to achieve. Okay, so some contemporary takes. They're everywhere. You just have to remember that this is a special time and you have to look for them. And so here's my ridiculous slide. You know, I'm a child of the early 1970s, and so of course Star Wars is in my blood to stay. And so Yoda, you know, points this out about the Force, that you must feel the Force around you, here, between you, me, the tree, the rock, everywhere. So he's training Luke on his ridiculous swamp planet of Dagobah. And so this is also true about immigration. It's everywhere. A lot of things are everywhere, of course. I think I used a slide to talk about how prices and economics are also ubiquitous. Yeah, so everybody who was born in the millennium probably is aware of like the Clone Wars cartoon. That's a pretty good one too, and Yoda shows up a decent amount in that as well. And let's not get into a discussion of the sequel series and all that. Okay. Well, this was remarkable because I was thinking about this yesterday as I was making the slides, and this is a tweet from Ilhan Omar. She actually represents the House district, the United States House of Representative district, in which I grew up. I wasn't born there, but I spent most of my years in that district. And it's a very diverse and heterogeneous place, growing more and more so over the last several decades. When I was little, I remember that there were immigrants from Southeast Asia called Hmong, H-M-O-N-G immigrants, which is an ethnic group rather than a national group per se. But there was a large influx of Hmong immigrants at that point. That was in the late 1970s after the Vietnam War disrupted a bunch of lives there. So Ilhan Omar was a Somalian refugee. She and her family, I think, first moved to New York or New Jersey, and then relocated to Minnesota, where there's a very large Somali American community now. And so she was the first in several ways of firsts in the United States House, first naturalized citizen from Africa to serve in the House. She was a refugee along with her family, first non-white woman elected in the state of Minnesota, and one of the two first Muslim women, along with Rashida I think it's Tlaib, although I don't know exactly how to pronounce that, but she's standing right here on the far left. And the other two members of what are called the squad are, I mean, everybody loves AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and also Ayanna Pressley, if I get her name pronounced correctly too. We're all very smart and impressive people. And so this was her tweet, which is revealing on several levels here. So the title that she's taking by a member of the media named Emily Jacobs appeared in the New York Post, which is traditionally a rather conservative newspaper. And she's pointing out that she didn't really like how the title implied her motives, that she feels are different. She feels her motives were that she'd like to get American taxpayers eligible for coronavirus aid, whereas the newspaper article explained it as wanting to get illegal immigrants, which again is the sort of pejorative term. And I think the preferable way of referring to people without documents is undocumented. This is an issue. It's part of the fiscal impacts topic of immigration. And the fact is, this is why it's revealing, that American taxpayers actually include unauthorized immigrants mostly. It's also true that some unauthorized immigrants don't pay taxes if they operate completely with cash and things like that. Sure, that can happen. But it turns out that a lot of unauthorized immigrants actually do pay taxes, many of them with the motivation of trying to become authorized at some point in the future, and one can do it in a variety of ways. It's not the easiest thing. So I thought this was revealing just because, here it shows up in the news, and also this points out this issue that on the one hand, if you're a native, or if you're a nativist or something, if you're of a particular political bent, you might not feel that coronavirus aid should be given to people who are unauthorized immigrants. Okay, if you think that aid should be given to American taxpayers, then that's sort of a conflict. The two ideas are conflicting, because it turns out that a lot of unauthorized immigrants actually pay taxes, which we'll talk about next week. Here's another topic in the news, a very sad one, that the headline in yesterday's New York Times article was that 8 UK doctors died from coronavirus and all were immigrants. And I think what they mean is that they are not British nationals. One of the challenges is understanding in different countries what the different terms are for people who are born abroad and may or may not have citizenship. And I suspect calling the 29% of the UK's doctors in the National Health Service hospitals are not British nationals means that they are not citizens per se. They are nationals of another country who have work visas, one would expect. But that's an open question. In the United States, we typically think about foreign-born people, and that percentage is quite high. Here in the second bullet, then, we're shifting to talking about physicians in the United States, and the story is a little similar and also a little different. So 29% are foreign-born, but 22% are citizens, are naturalized. 7% are not US citizens, and so they would be here either on a green card or on some work permit or something like that. So a large share of physicians. Doctors are very important, right? That's something I think we all know very well now. Maybe we always have known it. And foreign labor is very important, foreign-born labor. Part of the reason why this article is timely and sensational is that the UK has formally exited from the European Union via what's called the Brexit movement, which is referenced up here in the title. And ironically, one of the biggest pro-Brexit politicians is now the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. He's actually been in intensive care all this week now with the coronavirus. And the point then is that, well, the foreigners whom the Brexiteers were a little bit leery of appear to be helping, especially in the UK and especially in the United States in the health sector. They're the front line against this grave new threat, which is sobering. It's a sobering thing maybe to revisit one's prejudices about immigrants and their value. And I hope that people do revisit that. It does seem like there should be some revisiting. So what are the learning objectives here in this part of the course? There's the basic textbook model of the static macroeconomics of immigration. So we'll look at that today if we have time, definitely by next time. Suppose nothing adjusts yet. That's the trick in the short run. That's what the word static means. Nothing is adjusting in the short run. We'll look at the US labor market with supply and demand curves. And so that part I hope will be fairly familiar and easy to get one's head around. The thing that might be a little bit more challenging is examining winners and losers through looking at how a demand and supply curve imply that different groups receive different chunks of total output, which is the total area under the demand curve. We'll also, and this for sure will happen next week, we'll introduce a two-country version with ascending countries' labor demand curve superimposed. That I think will be a little confusing because what we'll start with is the traditional axes there with the quantity of labor and then the price of labor, or the wage here along the vertical axis, and there's a downward sloping labor demand curve. And what we're going to be introducing is another side of this, where if you suppose that the total amount of labor is the length of my two thumbs combined, you could graph the domestic labor demand curve sloping downward from this direction, and then the foreign labor demand curve sloping down from the other axis that you draw over here. So it's tough because this labor demand curve on this side is going to be what looks like upward sloping. It goes that way, and this other one goes downward sloping in the traditional way. And so that'll be a little challenging. But if you see it a couple of times, I think we'll be able to move past it, get our heads around it. Then we'll talk about the dynamic macroeconomics of immigration. And this has already appeared a couple of times in iClicker questions and discussions that we've had. So it'll be the solo model. And there are short run and long run effects of immigration. The short run effects in the solo model are the same as the effects in the static model. It's just that in the solo model, typically we don't look at the demand for labor, even though there actually is a labor demand curve there. So it looks like a different picture, but it's qualitatively the same thing. And what we saw in the solo model, of course, is that it's important about whether you discuss immigration as a shock, like a one-time change in the number of people in the country, because, for example, a Mariel boat lift might happen where Cuban, effectively political refugees are leaving Cuba. They're allowed to go by Fidel Castro. This is in 1979 or 1980, and they show up en masse in a one-time shock. So that's one view of immigration. The other view, though, of course, is that every year there are something like 1 million new immigrants who, unauthorized immigrants who arrive. What are the implications for a steady flow that looks like that? So those are quite qualitatively different. And of course, it depends on other assumptions too, like so qualitatively speaking, what sort of labor they supply, to what extent they supply labor. It could be that immigrants are very young and don't work yet, or they're very old and they don't work anymore. But of course, traditionally, a lot of immigrants are of working age, and so they're working in some way. And the question might be, what industry do they work in? So we'll look at the empirical literature next, and I think we won't get to that until next week. And the picture will be mixed. One view suggests that dynamic adjustment is important, and that was, I think I'm really influenced by how I served on as a consultant to the most recent National Academies panel, and this is something that David Card said when we had him in the room for an afternoon, and I'm partial to it. It's the view that it appears this dynamic model is probably more accurate, even in things where you think maybe the short-term model might be better. The economy actually adjusts, and it does so fairly quickly, quick enough at least for us not to be able to measure a really obvious negative impact of immigrants on wages or unemployment. We'll talk about the fiscal impacts. And the story there then will be, it's important to distinguish between the static or the snapshot picture of immigrant households, where because immigrants are typically young with young children, they usually are big net costs to government because they're young with children. First generation immigrants also typically have not a ton of education, which means they don't pay a lot in taxes. A lot of times, of course, new immigrants are legally barred from receiving benefits, but because they don't pay much in taxes, they can then as a household and even on an individual level, not have a particularly positive fiscal impact because they don't have lots of education. But over time, when you think about the aging of the immigrants themselves, but also their offspring, people who are called second-generation immigrants, who are native-born children of immigrants, the picture tends to be quite different. Both of these pictures are important. I think the one that is most obvious to most people is the snapshot or static picture. The less obvious one is the dynamic picture. And I think as good economists and as good demographers, we should be able to talk intelligently about the dynamic picture over a dinner party or something, over a Zoom dinner party where we're not actually eating with each other, but we're obviously talking to each other. We got to find something to talk about, and it could be the dynamic picture of immigration. You can say, hey, Grandpa, I know you don't like immigrants, but it turns out that over long periods of time, yes, they are costly in the short run, but in the long run, I promise, Grandpa, seriously, you got to listen to me here. Over the long run, the children of immigrants typically have high levels of education, and it actually is they who are paying your pension, Grandpa. That's what you can say. I'm sure that'll go over really well. Okay, the effects of immigration requires us to ask, and compared to what? This is one of the huge questions there. It could be compared to past immigrants. It could be compared to natives. It could be compared to no immigration. And the problem, of course, with that is that it's hard even to imagine what the United States would have looked like if there had never been any immigration past some date. It's hard even to imagine what it would look like if immigration fully stopped. We can occasionally do that, but even when we have natural experiments, which is, for example, the Mariel boat lift of Cuban political refugees in the early 1980s, even when we've got that, because of the nature of the data collection and because of the nature of the shock itself, ultimately, fortunately or unfortunately, what usually happens is that even the experts will interpret the results in a way that seems to depend on their point of view. There aren't any open and shut, obvious, slam dunk bottom lines in the economics of immigration. But it's important to become educated about the different parts of it all, about the different arguments on the theoretical sides, and about the different ways of interpreting the empirical evidence. Once coronavirus blows over, this, especially if Donald Trump is reelected in November, is probably going to be one of the really big questions moving forward, because his administration has made it very clear that they have absolutely no problem with basically ending immigration completely. Unless, of course, it would be more lives for certain people, something awful like that. So we need to be able to understand these arguments and the evidence and draw from it what we will, which does often depend on your point of view, but some points of view are a little bit more right than others, I think. So here's my second Star Wars pain, which I just love, because I don't even think I really understood this. I was only 10 years old when Obi-Wan said this to Luke, and here's Obi-Wan, of course, technically as a Force ghost, who says, Luke, you're going to find that many of the truths we claim to depend greatly on our own point of view. That's quite true about a lot of things, and it's true about the Force. That's what he was talking about, I guess. In particular, of course, whether or not Darth Vader had killed Luke's father, or actually was Luke's father, and Obi-Wan fudged that a bit. So that is true here with the economics of immigration. I think more so maybe than other things, or maybe it's just because like the identity of Luke's father and the Force. I mean, these are fairly highly charged things that we're talking about. The impact of immigration on the well-being of natives. What do natives and immigrants have to gain? What are they losing? So that's what we're all about, is to try to understand that. Let me just say too, part of the reason I'm wasting your time with my Star Wars fixation and Obi-Wan Kenobi, other than the fact that it's a fun picture to put up, and I regret not having more of them, although we'll get to that in a second. What you see about immigration in the literature does reflect people's points of view. And sometimes even panels of experts can, well, at least their remarks can be affected by this issue, that there are different points of view. And it doesn't mean that the National Academy's reports are biased at all, I don't think. I think they reflect the viewpoints represented on the panel, and the panels tend to reflect the prevailing views among academics. But it's also a matter for them to hash out on these panels of sort of arguing about what will and what won't make it in. Some of the reports have spoke more unequivocally than others. And I would unfortunately have to say, I think that the 2016 economics report, which I was a consultant on, speaks equivocally with, in other words, it doesn't really have a single voice. It says, well, here's a bunch of evidence, and we can't really, we can't really say that there's a single right answer. The sociology report in 2015, I think, much more clearly comes down on the side of saying that immigrants are assimilating. The 1997 report, I think, comes more clearly down on the side of immigrants appear to be net fiscal benefits over time. This is a function of who was on the panel at the time and the prevailing opinions among the scientists then, you know, at large, but also, of course, those who agree to actually be on the panel. So people have points of view, it's true. And you know, in climate science, that's probably also true, but I think there's a bit less of this fundamental problem. In immigration science, I think there are different perspectives about what really counts as ironclad evidence. But I also think, as you'll see, we will look at some of the empirical evidence here on the economics of immigration. I think you will probably be persuaded in one direction. But it's also okay if you're not, because there are a lot of people who are not persuaded by the evidence, and they look at other evidence that says very different things. So we'll talk about some background on US immigration first, which I think is important just to get us set up for success here, because there's a long history of this, and economists and many other people, not just economists, have been thinking about the impacts of immigration for a very, very long time. So it's useful not to have forgotten where we've been. Then if there's time today, we've got 25 minutes left or so here. We'll look at the simple one sector model and kick us off. And I think we're going to look at the empirical evidence next time. Has anybody heard of Angel Island and the US Immigration Station? Has anybody visited there? Raise your hand if you have. Oh, fantastic. One person has raised hands. Second person, yeah. I don't think a third person, I don't think this is widely known. Everybody knows about Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty, but here, a fifth person. Here in the bay, we actually have our own Ellis Island, and you can take a ferry out there. It's nowhere near as slick an experience as Ellis Island is at this point. Angel Island, it's a good question, actually. I think it's part of the National Park Service, but it's closer, of course, to Marin County, and Marin has this long tradition of trying to keep things as minimally developed as possible. So you can take a ferry out there, but it's a long trip, and I think once you get there, you'll be a bit surprised at how completely the reverse of Disneyland it is. It's very rustic. You can take self-guided and guided tours, and there's a large amount of Chinese poetry written on the walls, which it's a very moving experience. And here's an example of stuff that's written there. At the very top, I've got the text that was contributed by Zhou Yi, who used to be a GSI for this course, and I believe is now in a faculty position. I think he showed up earlier in the slides. So I asked him to translate this, and he said, well, it's a little hard because the top left one is a little scratched out, but it probably means something like, I was on the boat on the same day of Buddha's nirvana. And the motivation then was to sort of date it and think about when he got off the boat. And of course, this is a holding area where immigrants had to stay. And it wasn't pleasant, right, to be kept in a particular spot. So these are the sorts of things that you'll see there. We're a nation of immigrants and of anti-immigrants. And I think that was useful to think about, especially in 2016, which is the last time I taught this course. None of the fervor then was new. It seems to have taken center stage because of a rather unfortunate election result that was due to the Electoral College and Byzantine rules from the nation's birth, having to do with the rights of small states versus large states and the effective, if you like, disenfranchisement of California, because we are a very large state at this point, but we have a much more limited effect on presidential outcomes because of the Electoral College. In the early history, immigration was primarily from Western Europe, but there were waves from Ireland and Germany in the 1840s. And so part of this was the gold rush. Part of it was the great potato famine in Ireland. pushing Irish immigrants across to find greener pastures here in the United States. There was more informal control of immigration, but there always was control. And there always were these events, global panics. If you think today is crazy economically, it is. But of course, part of the reason why things are so crazy today is because we have such improved communication about what's happening in the world. And in these earlier periods, we had the telegraph, we had pieces of paper that tried to make it back and forth across oceans in maybe a month or something like that. And there were things like railroad financial bubbles, so investments in railroads in the United States, and how this. So here's another Downton Abbey reference, if that doesn't go over everybody's head. That one of the things that happens in the show is that Lord Grantham had invested in a bunch of U.S. railroads. It turns out that some of them actually were good investments, but a lot of them weren't. British money coming across the pond, going into investments in railroads. Looking at it now, of course, railroad investment seems like a pretty stupid idea. At the time, it was pretty good, especially in certain times, certain places. Over time, it became much less good, of course, the development of the automobile. All these sorts of things had impacts on flows of immigrants. Flows also from Asia in addition to Europe. And there was plenty of anti-immigrant sentiment in all of these periods. There always was. So this is my joke that you're not new, Donald, and I wrote this slide back in 2016, but just to point this out, anti-immigrant rhetoric is as old as the Republic itself. It's just that who is actually doing this anti-immigrant rhetoric tends to change quite a bit. I guess well, you could say a couple of things. The great irony is that the modern Republican Party took over by this guy who was an anti-immigrant, anti a lot of things, I guess, definitely pro himself. But traditionally, earlier in the 20th century, the Republican Party had been a very pro-immigrant political party, not so much for the Democratic Party, but those identities have been changing quite a bit. It's fluid. Natives have always been worried about perceived labor market competition and criminal activity by immigrants. And the new accusation ever since maybe the late 1800s, after the Civil War, we get what's called a welfare state that we discussed earlier, a system of pensions, of social supports and other things. And I guess the bottom line here is that none of these concerns are groundless on a prima facie level. In other words, just by looking at the concern, it doesn't make it groundless. But they're not new, and it turns out that once you investigate them, a lot of times you'll find that the concern might have been more than overblown. It might have been completely flying in the face of what appears to be empirical evidence that immigrants are really very good for lots of things like government budgets and for economic development and growth. That's one view. It's my view, obviously, as it's come through a bit, but it's not necessarily always the truth in every circumstance. Okay, a lot of heterogeneity then across immigrants. Immigrants are not just one group. The average immigrant assimilates, but that isn't necessarily true. That's the point of the sociology report in 2015. And it's a two-way street here, where immigrants become more American and the US becomes more like the immigrant. I think that also, is drawn from that report. It also, though, doesn't mean that all groups benefit en masse or that they all benefit in the same way. And I'm not sure, my guess is that also shows up in that report, but I think economists have often had the inside track on trying to identify the winners and losers with this kind of thing, at least in a monetary sense, is whose wages rise and whose wages fall, whose employment rises and whose falls, and over what time period. And the picture, when you descend into it, is much more heterogeneous, just like the story about immigration, generally speaking. Here at the bottom, this other point about less likely to engage in crimes than natives, but also immigrants seem to arrive healthier and they may pick up bad habits. And a big one there usually are things like smoking, but also diet can be a challenge. So undocumented status is a big issue these days. The number of unauthorized immigrants has actually fallen since the Great Recession, and it might be below 11 million, maybe 10.5, which is the current estimate out of uh, sorry, the Pew, I'm trying to remember what they're called exactly, PEW, which is a hilarious name, but it's the Pew Hispanic Research Shop, which is where Jeff Passell works. There are a variety of estimates of the number of unauthorized immigrants, but all of them are pretty much in that same range. And Jeff Passell is one of the big folks. Sorry, I'm just brain farting right now. It's been a long day already. It's the Pew Hispanic estimate that I'm referring to there, and Jeff Passell and his shop have churned those out very reliably over the years. The number of unauthorized had tripled between 1990 and 2007, which is a 6.5 average annual rate of increase. And that's big. And it tells you a little something, and why perhaps this has become such a hot button issue, such a huge winner for Donald Trump. And of course, I hadn't mentioned this before, maybe this is common knowledge, but it turns out that Trump employs a lot of unauthorized immigrants in all the hotels that he owns. I don't even know if personally he even cares about unauthorized immigrants. But it was a hugely successful political issue, and it's still tremendously salient. And here's part of the reason why: a tripling of the number of unauthorized immigrants in the country. So the stock of unauthorized immigrants, which is just a big increase. Prior to 1990, of course, there was the Great Immigration Reform Act of 1986 that we'll talk about too, which provided a path for legal status for a bunch of unauthorized immigrants and reduced that number, at least in the very short run. We think that unauthorized immigrants don't assimilate as well as others do. And of course, this is a sort of a rational choice if you thought about it from the perspective of an unauthorized immigrant. If you can be deported at any time, you have much less incentive to invest in US specific skills and other things. We talked about investment in, say, marriage capital when we were discussing the economics of marriages. And there are many intangible things, just like marriage capital, that are relevant for workers and for people living in communities. If you're unauthorized and you know that all that could just vanish in a puff of smoke and you're back on a plane being taken to your home country by ICE, you might well choose not to invest in those sorts of things that otherwise would provide for your assimilation more rapidly. Here is a time series, and this is from the sociology report, of the number of immigrants and the percent of the population. That's the line here. So the number of immigrants, the flow each year, I'm sorry, the number of immigrants meaning the stock of foreign born, I apologize. That's one of the big problems here, is to try to keep straight. Do you mean by immigrants the number of people who arrive each year, or do you mean the total stock of immigrants? And by that, we usually mean the foreign-born population. And in 2012, it was a number like 41, say, or 40 million.5 or something like that. So that's this number here of the tall box. As a percent then of the population, that's the line, and the axis that measures it is here on the right. And so we're here around 13 or so in 2012, and I think the number is stated roughly the same. So it's close to historic highs. We're not at the same levels that we were in the late 1800s, when absolutely nobody was alive. Nobody alive today was alive during a period of a greater foreign-born share of the population. Everybody alive today was alive through all this period here. Famously, so Donald Trump, like he loves, I'm sure, the fact I'm talking about him all the time, but his paternal grandfather died, what we think is part of the Spanish flu back here in 1918. So he was alive then, but I don't believe he was. I think he was born more like in the 40s, given how old I think he is, probably. So the fact that this is historically high, except for this period, well, it's historically high really in kind of the modern era. It's a very large number, which is not to say that that's bad. It's just to say that it's somewhat unprecedented. There's a strong shift toward immigrants from the Americas and Asia since 1960. Back then, if you look at the crimson bar here, the proportion of the foreign-born population, I think that's got to be, since it falls somewhat slowly here, we're almost at 70% from parts of Europe. And of course, a lot of that probably was refugees from World War II and other movements of people for economic reasons. And then a very, very strong shift toward the Americas and also toward immigrants from Asia. A big growth in the share who were Mexican. So this is the foreign-born population. We're talking mostly about Mexican Americans, meaning that they are naturalized citizens, but the unauthorized also are part of this total, and also people who aren't citizens or aren't naturalized, but who are legal permanent residents. A big increase then, and this dates all the way back to 1850. So we're talking about a very lengthy period of time here. And one of the remarkable things I had noticed was I think that the people who owned the house that my family and I live in, I believe, were probably of Mexican ancestry. And I think they probably arrived during these earlier periods. The house was built in 1947. And I think they were the very first owners, although we won't know that until we look at the census of 1950 for sure and see whether they were occupying the house. But I think probably they were, and I think they were from these earlier waves of Mexican immigrants. Back here. So a very big increase then during this post-1965 era of the amount of immigrants who are Mexican. But what's interesting is that most recently, and maybe you are aware of this, I don't think I had fully internalized it, but the modal immigrant actually has changed identities from being Latino or Latinx or Latina to being Asian. So that's the red line here, where we're looking at just the data since 2000, and we're seeing a very big change. Now, Asian, I'm pretty sure here means you can come from China, or of course Japan or Korea or Vietnam. You can also come from India, I would imagine, and you're still qualify here as being Asian. So it's a very big mixed group, whereas the Latino arrivals are going to be somewhat more limited to Mexico and there'll be refugees there from some of the troubled Central American countries, which is kind of a big deal there as well. But it would be people from South America too. I can ask Felipe to weigh in on whether, I guess Latino probably would qualify as covering people from Brazil, but the word Hispanic traditionally has not covered people from Brazil. And I kind of doubt that they are broken out separately here. I think they probably are in, well, because we're calling it Latino arrivals. That's always one of the issues, is sort of what you do to reference these very broad parts of the globe geographically in a concise way, and it's rather difficult sometimes. So the TFR, here's another thing that probably you've been aware of. The TFR is strongly higher, and this was in the about 10 years ago now, so centered around, say, the 2010 American Community Survey. The total fertility rate among foreign-born as opposed to US-born was much, much higher. As we tried to point out when we were talking about the economics of fertility, the thing about the TFR is that it reflects the current conditions of people. It doesn't reflect the lifetime fertility choices. And that's true for both of these. It's just that, well, why would that be salient here? Foreign-born is going to include a lot of newly arrived immigrants who typically are much younger. And so they are at childbearing ages, and they have probably thought about when they're immigrating and thought a little bit about timing their fertility around that. So there's a reason to think that this might be rather an overestimate of what the total long-term effect really might be. Which ought to be a cohort measure of foreign-born people. What does their completed fertility look like compared to US-born people? And the cohort measure would not show this issue about the timing of it all being correlated with an arrival as an immigrant. So it's a lot of words, but what I'm trying to say is that it's not obvious really that in the long run, immigrant women actually have more children than US-born women. What is true is that there's a higher TFR associated with foreign-born, and that will push up the US TFR. That's true, because it has to be true. It's just that if you're thinking about lifetime family sizes, that's a bit of a different issue. Here's a great graph, again, from the sociology report that splits the US born versus the foreign born across these different educational categories. And there is similarity here at the far right-hand side. And of course, you will be in this category here, and there's a decent amount of similarity there. But it is really striking that this group, for example, is much more native than foreign born. The folks with some college or associates, the high school graduates are actually, in other words, you just have high school, you didn't go to college. It's somewhat more likely that you're US born here. And I think that the story is that we're summing these across the blue. So the blue sums to 100. The sum of all the reds is probably 100. At least I certainly hope so. I didn't make the figure. That was the National Academies and the Sociology panel, but I'm sure Mary Waters checked this and made sure it was right. So what stands out is that here there's actually a lot of similarity among the shares of these two groups who have advanced degrees, right? So these are PhDs, these are MDs, these are the doctors that we read about in the news story at the beginning of class. And there's also a ton of less than high school people among the foreign born. And not exclusively, but many of these are the Mexican American immigrants who arrive with not a lot of education. What happens, of course, over time to them, and especially their children, is a different story, but this is the snapshot of the foreign born. So here's something showing the difference in the gender gap of earnings, and I wonder how they're defining earnings here. Probably labor earnings, I think. And what is interesting is that it shows this big, inequality here favoring men among the U.S. born, and a much smaller inequality between men and women among the foreign born. And it could be a penalty for foreign born men. It could be a variety of things. Here's a look at household income, which is similar to the earnings, but it's going to include potentially capital income as well. You could look at natives versus foreign born, which is on the far left-hand side, and this is in 2010. If the numbers seem a little bit small, they're not enormous. So 50,000 or 45,000 roughly for the foreign born, something like that. And then big differences by sending region in this metric among the foreign born. So I think the way to think about this is that all these bars here on the right-hand side of the graph, which are looking at different households by nativity, I guess by origin, because I think most people, in fact, will be naturalized, and then some sort of weighted average of all these things gets you this red bar over here on the left, which is about 40, maybe 46,000. Here, I guess what stands out mostly is that the Mexicans and the Latin Americans have the lowest household income. There are plenty of other groups that actually have higher median household income among the groups. Say, if you looked at the very heterogeneous group of people from Asia, and also say Oceania, which is going to include, I think, the Philippines. I wonder if, yeah, that's a good question, what exactly that means, but I think it's mostly people in the Pacific Ocean and the island nations that are out there. It turns out that they're quite well off in terms of their median household income. So big differences, and certainly differences in education that are probably underpinning all of these things. Here is a story about the poverty rates of families, percents of families that are in poverty for among all families, and then in the next several bars, splitting it up across different statuses here. So families with children under 5, that would be, for example, my household. Families with children under 18, I think I also count in that as well. High poverty rates among the foreign-born headed households, or families, I guess we're talking about here. Households and families are similar concepts. Among married couple families, again, a much reduced level of poverty among the US born, but a higher level of poverty among the foreign born. And so I think the way to view this is that it's not super rosy being foreign born in the United States. A lot of times it's associated with poverty, especially, well, and I guess on the far right here, what you can say is, again, kids don't get pregnant, stay in school, don't become a single mother, because if you do, regardless of what your immigration status is and your nativity history, there's going to be a high rate of poverty for families described by that as being headed by a single mother. Here's our first look at a statistic then for the number of unauthorized immigrants. And so this is this rapid growth since 1990 in the stock of unauthorized immigrants estimated to be residing in the United States, rising from 3.5 million up to a peak here. And of course, there's a reason for this. The peak, I think, was maybe in 2007. And of course, what happened in 2008? The last enormous Great Recession, in a much slower fashion, and probably in a way that allowed for more people to leave. You know, a fascinating thing would be to say, and I've got only 3 minutes left, but given this, I think you would expect probably to see, if these data were extended into 2020 and beyond, on the one hand, probably another reduction after this year. But that's only if shelter in place ever gets lifted, because you have to actually be able to leave if you're not in the country anymore. So unauthorized immigrants appeared to leave. So net reductions in the stock of people in the country who were here on an unauthorized basis after the Great Recession. And for obvious reasons, the Great Recession hits, a lot of jobs evaporated. Whether we'll see that again is unclear, but it's clear that immigration responds to economic conditions. So I've got 2 minutes left. Let me just show a couple more things, and that is, it is interesting to think about the politics of all this, and opinion polls are useful here. So here's a time series that ends, unfortunately, I think in 2015, probably, with the, I guess, because these look like every 2 years or so. And again, this is from the Sociology Report, which has done such a great job putting this together. And here's an opinion poll company. On the next slide, I'm going to have Gallup, which is another one. I guess Gallup, right? I want to say Gallup or Gollop. I don't know. I have no clue how to pronounce that. A horse galloping. I'm sorry. I just embarrassed myself, didn't I? Well, what do we see here? We see some reductions, I guess, but you know, there's a lot of flatness here. Maybe a reduction in the share of people who said it was a good thing prior to this great political cataclysm of 2016. Maybe an increase in this. Well, that's one perspective. The other perspective here is it's been rather flat. And if we look on the next page, here's a picture with a fairly long history also, but more recent history. So here's the great cataclysmic political year of 2016. And what has happened since there? Well, actually maybe an increase in the share who, in this poll, who say that immigration should be increased. So that's the dark green line. Maybe a decrease in the gray, then it seems to be a little bit of a funny dip up here. I don't know, maybe around the time we all found out about coronavirus, I really have no clue. So fluctuations, but I think you would say from this, though, that there's not really an obvious sea change toward anti-immigrant sentiment. It might just be that some are much more vociferous in their opposition. Okay, so next time we're going to dive into this. So we didn't quite get here, but there's where I'll end, and I'll take questions if people would like to stick around. Otherwise, we can adjourn for next time. I hope this was interesting and answered some background questions. Well, thanks for coming along for the ride. Again, you can type out a question in chat or raise your hand, or we can convene again next week. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. I think I'll go ahead and end the, I'm glad the Star Wars references weren't lost on everybody. I know that Star Wars is kind of silly, but I really love it. Thank you very much, everyone. See you next week then.